Hey everybody, Danny Gutierrez here. Hope you guys are doing okay. Hope everybody's safe. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Total Fight Mike. It's been a little bit since we last spoke. Last time I talked to you guys, it was the Cynthia Calvillo and Jessica Eye fight. And I was supposed to do a preview for Curtis Blaydes and Alexander Volkov. Had to work on some personal things that I had to take care of myself. But we are back, and Cynthia Calvillo looked great against Jessica Eye. Jessica Eye is 1-1 in her last two. Cynthia Calvillo looked phenomenal in her 125-pound debut. She looked strong. She looked disciplined. Her ground game looked as disciplined as ever, as tight as ever. She had great striking power, and this was actually the first camp that she had away from Team Alpha Male, because I had actually heard that she had been training at American Kickboxing Academy for this particular bout, this past bout, the bout that took place 2 weeks ago. So it was pretty interesting to see what changes she was implementing with her striking and her distance control. She looked very well on the feet. She was moving very well laterally, left and right. She was utilizing fakes and feints, faking and feinting, and she actually was utilizing her striking and engaging in the striking very well. And when she didn't feel comfortable in engaging with the striking against Jessica Eye, she just immediately took her down. And what she would try and do is that she would try and set her up with the takedowns, trying to get her to engage with some boxing exchanges or some kickboxing exchanges on the feet. This would allow Cynthia Calvillo to change levels and take her down. And this was basically the story throughout the 5-round fight that they had. At the end of the rounds, Cynthia Calvillo would take her down and basically beat her up from top mount position or back mount position. So where did the two girls go from here? Cynthia Calvillo is probably going to crack the top 10, or excuse me, top 5 actually. And Jessica Eye probably moves no less down to maybe number 3 or number 4 in the ranking spot. But maybe another good fight for her to bring her back would actually do pretty good for her. She was actually doing pretty good in that fight against Cynthia Calvillo, so I don't think that those bouts were. I didn't think that bout was a complete blowout by Cynthia Calvillo against Jessica Eye, but that was a good fight from both girls. But Cynthia Calvillo got the unanimous decision win. Now, fast forwarding to last weekend's bouts with Alexander Volkov and Curtis Razor Blaydes. Now, I didn't watch a whole bunch of interviews going into that fight. It was just specifically because of the scheduling that the UFC is putting out for these bouts. So basically back to back to back to back to back to back. It's a little bit difficult to kind of keep up with what everybody's saying, especially since you have a whole list of other fighters that you want to hear about what they are saying. But a whole lot of how should I put this? A whole lot of complaints about fighter pay have been coming out, from former UFC fighters and current UFC fighters. You hear Gray Maynard talking to Luke Thomas. You hear Sugar Sean O'Malley saying that he wants to get paid what he's worth. And you had, I didn't listen to this audio, but I suppose Curtis Razor Blaydes was kind of siding with what everybody's issues were with fighter pay, kind of stating the fact that, the money's there, just pay us or don't pay us, but the money is there. Guys have bought an island and this and that. I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but Curtis Blaydes had some concerns about fighter pay, and who wouldn't if you're a UFC fighter and you want to get paid more? I mean, who doesn't want to get paid more? But going into this fight, it was going to see it was going to be interesting to see how Curtis Blaydes would handle himself going into a bout against Alexander Volkov, who's a former Bellator heavyweight champion, and his only loss in the UFC, I believe, was to a Derek Lewis. Now, that was a crazy fight. Excuse me, guys. It was a pretty crazy fight. It was actually pretty one-sided until it wasn't. Alexander Volkov was picking him apart on angles, at distance, on the feet, and then basically Derek Lewis just lands a Hail Mary and knocks out Alexander Volkov and gets the W. Alexander Volkov came back from a long layoff against Greg Hardy, in which he looked good against Greg Hardy, and this was kind of more or less a comeback to title contention, because Curtis Blades has beaten everybody who isn't whose name isn't Francis Ngannou, because those are his only losses in his entire career. Forget the UFC; those are his only losses in his entire career, and those are the only two that he dropped against Francis Ngannou. And Alexander Volkov, being a former champion in another organization, this is going to be a very interesting fight. And again, this was a classic striker versus grappler matchup. Curtis Blades just took it to him, and he was able to take him down at will for the first 3 rounds. I say the first 3 rounds because the 4th and 5th rounds, Curtis looked a little bit, I won't say gassed, but he looked exhausted. He looked exhausted. After the post-fight interview, he was kind of breathing very heavy, and it was very hard for him to answer any of the questions that John Anik was wanting to ask of him. But that was a very hard fight. It was a very hard fight, especially when you have some striker like Alexander Volkov who could keep it on the feet as well as he does. I was actually very impressed with Alexander Volkov's ability to defend himself from his back. Now, when you use words like defend himself off of his back, that makes me think that he's actually, threatening with submissions, as well as trying to establish or trying to control the posture of his opponent while he's on his back. But with his arms and his legs, he was able to he being Alexander Volkov, he was able to wrap up the arms and nullify the ground and pound of Curtis Razor Blades with his legs and his arms. So it was pretty interesting to see that Alexander Volkov has some defensive skills from his back, off of his back, but it turned out to not be enough, and Curtis Razor Blades from Chicago, Illinois, got the W against Alexander Volkov. Now, this weekend coming up, I believe it's June 27th or the 28th, is a lightweight bout against Dan Hooker and Dustin Poirier. Now, Dan Hooker is New Zealander who actually trains with Israel Adesanya at with Coach Eugene Behrman. It's not Hard Knocks Kickboxing. Oh my goodness, that's Henry Hoof's gym. This is going to kill me. City Kickboxing. Thank you very much. City Kickboxing with Eugene Merriman and Israel Adesanya is where Dan Hooker trains. Occasionally they'll get Alexander Volkanovski in there. Kai Kara France is another guy that they have coming out of that camp. But he's been on a roll himself, and he's going up against American top team trained Dustin Poirier, who is the former interim lightweight champion. He's actually coming off of a loss against his title fight against Khabib Nurmagomedov. Now, that was a very tough fight for both guys. It was a little bit tougher of about for Dustin Poirier, because he was right there, and he also he landed some punches on Khabib, and he actually threatened with a guillotine pretty early on in the fight. I think it was early in the second round, or midway through the second round, I believe, where he threatened with that guillotine, and it looked tight. But Khabib's Khabib, and he's not going to be taken out of there with a guillotine, not like that. This is going to be a very interesting fight. Dan Hooker being an orthodox fighter, and Dustin Poirier being the southpaw fighter. Although both guys can switch stances, but both guys are actually better in their respected stances of orthodox and southpaw. Dan Hooker's got one-punch knockout power. You saw him knock out James Vick very stiflingly. He does like to utilize faking and feinting a lot, like his training partner Israel Adesanya. He's a very long, rangy lightweight, and he does have power at the end of those shots. Dustin Poirier, he's 5'9", but he's got these very long arms. He's got phenomenal boxing techniques. He's got some pretty decent leg kicks and body kicks, and pretty decent knees inside the clinch. He's very strong inside the clinch. He's got a very underrated ground game, an underrated wrestling game, underrated Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu skills, very underrated submission skills. And again, he has heavy power in both of his hands. His lead right hook and his his left cross from orthodox stance. So this will be a very interesting fight to see from both guys. I actually wonder if you actually get to wonder with that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt and that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu background from Tim Crater in Lafayette, Louisiana, what will Dustin Poirier implement the ground game again, initiate the ground game, initiate the takedown against Dan Hooker? Because Dan Hooker, being with his striking pedigree and the resume that he's built up, throughout his career at lightweight in the UFC, it's pretty interesting. He's got a pretty solid resume there. Now, does Dustin Poirier feel confident that he can knock out Dan Hooker? Probably, but we're going to see what tricks Dan Hooker has up his sleeve, because his last fight against Paul Felder was it was a tough fight. It was a very tough fight. Both guys showed a lot of heart. I actually thought that Paul Felder slightly should have gotten the nod over a very tough Dan Hooker. But the judges saw it another way, and Dan Hooker was your winner, and that extended his winning streak. And we are here now, and he will be fighting Dustin Poirier at UFC Fight Night this Saturday. So thank you guys so much for joining me on this episode of the Total Fight Mike. Please click the share, like, and subscribe button. Leave a comment down below. Let me know what you guys thought of the video, and I will see you guys in the sequel. Thank you guys so much. Thank you to my editor, Pat, and bye, everybody.